Welcome. So before we start, who here is building applications with some sort of AI in it? Okay. So a lot of folks are already starting. Who here is like, you're here because you're like, I think we want to do it. We're interested. We want to know before we experiment. Okay, a few people. Nice. So yeah, let's kick things off. I'm Jason Yee. I'm a staff technical advocate at Datadog.
And I'm Joe Croney. I'm CTO of ArcXP, which is a division of the Washington Post. And we are raising our hands on our team for building stuff on AI, using observability. But also, we're spending a lot of time talking about ethics, how we can use this properly to enhance our brand for our consumer experience. And that's part of the topic today as well. One way to start is really the origin story for ArcXP to give you some reference of where we're coming from. Back in 2011, the Washington Post saw that their print business was going to go into decline, and they needed to do a digital transformation. And they were wise enough at the time to see that the technology they had in place was optimized for print, and they needed to start from a clean whiteboard and figure out what system they needed for the future. And that's what ArcXP was born out of. Fast forward to today, we commercialized it, and we run thousands of other media companies on that SaaS platform. And one of the things we've heard within the Post and from our broad base of other publishers and broadcasters is they want to use generative AI, but they're concerned about what that means for their journalists, for their storytelling, and for their business. So a little bit about ArcXP. We definitely believe in the power of storytelling to change the world, and we think generative AI is a big piece of that. And we've got a variety of different value propositions behind it. And these are some of the brands that sit on top of ours. So when I talk today about ArcXP, we bring the lineage of the Washington Post, but we also are thinking about a very broad landscape of storytellers and business models that are out there. So, of course, we're at AWS reInvent. I couldn't not have some slide that showed some of their diagrams and components. I'm fortunate to have been built from the ground up in AWS using great services. It's all serverless technology. It was not a lift and shift platform. So as CTO, I was very fortunate to inherit that kind of a tech stack. But another big thing that we're fortunate to use is best-of-breed solutions, whether that's AWS itself, Okta, GitHub, Splunk, and of course, Datadog. So on that note, Jason, tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, so for those who don't know Datadog, if you haven't run into the giant Stonehenge of purple pillars in the expo hall, we are a monitoring and observability platform. We help you with everything from performance, reliability, and security. But when we started thinking about things about 2.5 years ago, we had this idea, and we'll go to the next slide here, of what can we do to really experiment with AI, right? 2.5 years ago, if you think back to like ChatGPT was starting to come up, a lot of people were really starting to get interested in LLMs, and it seemed like the technology had really turned a corner. And so as we thought about it, as the critical observability piece for our customers, we're like, how can we actually integrate this into our systems? And so we had this idea, imagine that it's late at night, and you're an SRE, and you get an alert, and it usually looks something like this, right? You get an alert on your phone, and it says that something has gone wrong, and for most folks, if you've been in an SRE role, the message is good luck, right? But if you're good, maybe you have a team, and they've got like, here's some run books, here's the metric that you're looking at, but even that is not much better than just saying good luck. And so we had this idea of, what would happen if the AI could actually help you out? You get an alert, and it could actually look at what's going on in your system and summarize it for you and point out where you might actually need to fix things. As you're working on it, it could inform other people on your team so they're not interrupting you, asking for the status of what you're doing. And ultimately, maybe it could actually help you prevent those sort of outages. And so with this in mind, we decided to give Bits, our Datadog puppy here, a little bit of superpowers. And we created a thing that we called Bits AI. And so as we set off on this journey, we knew, like everything else with Datadog, that we had to build with observability in mind. So we started that. We started with our traditional tools of metrics and tracing, or APM, and logs, obviously, to collect the messages. And we had all of these things, but they didn't quite capture enough. But I'll leave my story there and let Joe take over to talk about their journey.
And to make it real for us at ArcXP, we rely heavily on Datadog for those alerts. So Tuesday morning, my phone went off, and it's because one of our customers is in South Korea. And if you were watching the news, you may have noticed they declared martial law. And they were very concerned about the uptime of their system. They thought there was a problem, so immediately I'm on a bridge with my team looking at Datadog. And we were able to say, actually, there's no problem here at all, except for your traffic has gone up by 25% in the last hour. So your system's good to go. But that's the kind of thing in the world of media and news. It's so important to our customers to have incredible uptime, because if they can't deliver that message and that storytelling, it really impacts their brand and their business. And so Datadog's essential for us in that media world, especially. So, this is actually a picture from the Washington Post office in DC. You might know that our owner has some shared interests with AWS here itself. And we've got this quote that he really wants us to make sure that we understand what's dangerous, even in the world of media, is to not evolve. And when you think about media, you might think about legacy publishers. You might think of newspapers, radio, broadcast. Also think about digital experiences, OTT. There's a lot of innovation, but as an industry, we really need to be a little bit more forward-thinking, especially in this moment of difficult business climate for media. So this was first front and center for us as we started thinking about AI and the potential there. These are some of the themes that are in the media industry about ideas of what CTOs, CEOs, and boards are asking their media companies to take advantage of. Things like audio and video editing, captioning, the archiving, the scheduling, personalization. All of these are basically hot topics in media for opportunities to use generative AI to improve the fundamentals of the business. However, with anything big and new, you got to figure out a place to start. And even before that, especially in our world of media, we had to think about how can we use these tools ethically. Take something like personalization or news and sports production or captioning. If we're doing synthesization of people's voices, there's a lot of ethical concerns there. If we're changing the content of an article, if we're leveraging LLM models for fact checking, it better be right. And so that's the kind of thing that really gave us pause before we dove into the water on any of these themes. And we were thinking about what's the balance as an industry that's most important? How do we capture that AI innovation? How do we evolve and kind of lean into these new areas? How do we make sure we have the right ethics and we protect our brand? And ultimately, all of this only matters for how much value we bring to our customers. How much can we really give those personal and engaging experiences to our readers, to our viewers? And overall, as an industry, the conversation has been for the last year or two, how do we balance these three things? So with that in mind, we actually began at ArcXP with a pretty clear guidepost for what we thought was necessary to frame out all the innovation and how we use those tools. And the key part of that guidepost was really using generative AI products in an ethical way to accelerate content production and elevate the customer experience. So as we thought about each one of those areas where there was potential to drive business value, potential to increase our consumer experience or B2B experience, we reminded ourselves of this mission statement to make sure we didn't go off the rails, so to speak, and end up using these powerful tools in a way that would be detrimental to our business. So that's one of our lessons that we'll talk about later on. Practically, there's a lot of great announcements this week that we've seen in keynotes for advances in Bedrock, advances in the models inside of Bedrock. And so, we've heard from some of our customers, it's kind of overwhelming to think about where to begin. So this is a little bit of insight into our pattern for the journey we chose as we thought about the tools. We thought about 3 steps. First, about how we can improve workflows and productivity of newsrooms. Then we thought about the experience that our consumers might have. And finally, where we're aiming for is to have whole new products that consumers get as they're getting storytelling, receiving it, getting customized versions. So on each one of these fronts, we kind of have a product roadmap. We have an AI editorial assistant, which is designed to assist the journalist storyteller with the experience of their stories. Then we have personalized content experiences. So an example there would be if you happen to be an NFL fan, you're watching your favorite team over the weekend, you're looking at coverage the next day, you might imagine that coverage will be personalized to understand who your favorite team is. And so that's what we're looking to do on the experience side. And then new products really for us is thinking about giving a unique experience to every reader, a unique story to every viewer, and that can be done while still remaining ethical and true to the original storyteller's intent. So as a software company, instead of jumping to Figma and screen designs, we actually went to the whiteboard and thought about APIs. We thought about the API-first approach for what would be needed underneath these capabilities, and thinking about the observability that was necessary, the AWS tool set that would come behind it. And so that's where we really had this platform that combined fine-tuning, a vector database for vectorization, and the AI editor experience with all the tools and features that we'd line up in the APIs itself. So that's how we began that effort. And I think I would share that that was really successful for us, as opposed to going way down the route of a fancy UX experience. We thought about the fundamental building blocks. I like to talk about Legos quite a bit, where AWS is great at giving you the one-by-one tiny Legos, and all of us have to amass those into models. So this was our abstraction layer to get the little bigger blocks that we could then build the experiences on top of. So all that came together. Here's a little bit of the experience we have today in newsrooms for journalists around the world, where they can be working on a story in what we call Composer. That's our tool for authoring content. And they get quick access to generative AI tools that can do everything from summarization to tagging to translation to text-to-speech to coming up with alternative headlines. And all of this, we really thought about the ethical approach, where it's not just taking over the story, it's offering options which are then curated by the journalist. So this is an example where the UX was really important to stay true to that guidepost and mission of we didn't allow basically the whole story to be generated. Instead, we had that assistant type model. And we've had great reaction from this in newsrooms, but it didn't go straight out like this with all the features. Instead, it was a very agile approach that started with what we call labs. Our labs team met with customers. We had customers come to us and want to engage in a program of experimentation, of innovation exchange, and see where they wanted to go with their newsroom. So we collected with them. We gave them access to early APIs in the platform, went through proofs of concept, had our private betas, and then we were ready to go to market with this. Well, in the world of software, we talk a lot about shift left. Shift left, you began with shifting left in the testing paradigm. Then we talked about shifting left with security. We talked about shifting left with observability. In new areas like AI, sometimes that doesn't happen until you get to the last moment. And that's what was for us. We really found as we were about to bring this out that we had to catch up with our normal practices in the SDLC to be prepared to observe what we were about to launch. Because it was all fine and good to have prototypes and get early feedback, but we saw early on that the models could go off, it could really drift from what we wanted them to do. They could hallucinate. They could give information that wasn't in concert with our goals, and so we needed to observe how that was happening. So some of those questions for us that we asked as we went to prod: how do we reliably identify hallucinations? How do we protect against abuse? How do we ensure the model doesn't leak sensitive personal data, sensitive editorial data? A lot of our customers are highly concerned that as they do tooling that leverages generative AI, that their IP is being leaked to train in models and will appear somewhere else in a way that damages their brand. Then finally, as a CTO, I'm concerned about the bill I'm going to get from AWS every month. I'm concerned about overruns. What happens if someone's hitting that API and just slamming it, and we end up with very expensive query times? And all of that really led us to know that we needed observability, which is a great thing for Jason to share.
Yeah, so we both ended up in that same place, right? We were working with AI, and we knew that we needed observability. So the great thing for us at Datadog is when we were starting that Bits AI project, we also had a team that had already started working on LLM observability. We figured that just like us, we have a lot of innovative customers like ArcXP who are going to jump on it soon, and they're going to need tools. But as we did that, we didn't want to just repackage our existing tools. We have a lot of tools that are great, things like APM, where you can really trace through your code. And it's fantastic, and you need those for building your products. But we realize that when you get into this, it can help you see your performance. If you have an error, it'll bubble that up. But ultimately, this is not really what happens when you're working with LLMs, right? You have the application side, but as Joe mentioned, there are a bunch of other concerns that aren't really around performance. They're not standard like you would have an error in a line of code. And so this didn't get us far enough. We needed something that could look more at the inputs and the outputs, look at token use, et cetera, and we couldn't just attach those to existing tools. So we ended up designing LLM observability to give ourselves and to give all of you better end-to-end tracing, not just from an application perspective, but actually into what's happening with your data. And so having that in an interface that actually tracks what's going on with your inputs, what's going on as that data is moving through the system, and finally, what happens to your outputs. And then with your outputs, how do you actually evaluate those? Because again, right, if an LLM hallucinates, that is very different than Python throwing an error or Node.js saying that the types mismatch. And so we built the interface to actually allow it to evaluate every single word that's coming as an output and check that for things like sentiment and check that for accuracy. And then also to allow you to compare models. Now I know AWS just released some great tools that automatically help you choose the right model. And that's primarily based on cost and performance. But ultimately, it's going to come down to folks like you and me and all the engineers to actually evaluate what are the things coming out, what do my customers actually need to get the correct data, to ensure that it's not leaking data, to ensure that they're actually getting good value out of it. And so the final part that we added into the tool, aside from just evaluating it, is this notion of, can we start to see trends? One of the things that we found with LLMs is being non-deterministic, you get these errors, and it's very hard to correlate. Is the hallucination from one prompt similar to another prompt, especially when those prompts are completely different? But we understood that oftentimes the root issue could really be something similar. And so we built some tools in there to help you group that up and start to see those trends that wouldn't normally be surfaced.
All right. And it looks pretty good on a screenshot.
It
does.
That's
that never hurts. So I talked about balance in terms of how we approached these new capabilities. When we thought about the balance for what we needed from observability, it was around quality, ensuring the AI output met the standards. And those standards are different for every one of ArcXP's customers. Our customers like Le Parisien in Paris, they have a very different take on the tone of voice that's essential in their publications than we see in a firm like Gray that has video production across the US. And so the definition of quality for broadcasters, for publishers, digital agencies, that balance had to be different, and we had to be able to tune and observe that these capabilities were matching what they needed. We need to make sure that the workflow and efficiency was correct, so we do use a variety of Datadog tools for observability within our SaaS applications, so making sure as they use that editor experience that the workflow is proper. Cost, I mentioned earlier, making sure that what we were doing was sustainable. We've all read about how AI is consuming immense amounts of environmental resources, and that's part of our brand promise, is to make sure we're responsibly consuming those services in a way that's important across the world. We think about AI autonomy, controlling AI to prevent errors and unintended actions. So that's the case where we might do a translation of a story, leveraging a model, and it could change the actual meaning. It could change the facts. All that was super important for us to keep an eye on, to have alerting on, to make sure our product was staying within those ethical boundaries. And finally, having the right human oversight. And that's about those ethical standards I mentioned and correcting when AI was needed. So there were a variety of concerns that were bespoke. They were different than how we had used observability in the past for just making sure the bandwidth was operating, the CDN was proper, our logging and APIs were performing correctly, all the incredible security services we rely on Datadog for threat detection. Those are all in a different space, really, Jason. And as you said, we found as we entered observability for AI, we had to scratch our heads a little bit. It was a little different of an approach. And I think some of the tools that you were sharing demonstrated that. So in practice, when these all came together, this is from a live dashboard, a screenshot not long ago, showing the activity going in one of our lab environments for looking at error rates, looking at tracing, where the prompts had been used. Did they get out of hand? Did they take a long time to execute? So this chart looks pretty familiar for those of you that are in Datadog for core metrics that we see for observability. But then we went to the next layer. I mentioned that sometimes we have quality control concerns in what comes back from the prompts. And this is an example where we saw a pretty drastic scenario where what was coming out of that AI editor for a particular topic and context of a story was by and large irrelevant. And that's not doing very much for our users. And even worse, if they were to take that content that was suggested, slam it into the story and publish it, that's not going to be the editorial experience that they're expecting from their customers. So that's something we saw in action. And this is an example where, as we went through beta and alpha and POCs, we were seeking to get this KPI to the right level before we introduced it to the broad market. And so that's that experimentation I showed earlier. It did have an interchange with, once we had observability in place, understanding where my team had more work to do. More work to do in the unit testing, the quality control, the prompt engineering, the training of those models. Solving this one wasn't easy. I think this particular one was one of the buttons we have is around tagging. So today, most media companies, when they're publishing content, they're trying to figure out just the right SEO tags to bring in traffic. We have a wealth of historical information from our customers from years of manually tagging stories and videos for what they think is optimal. So you would think that, okay, I can take that article and just any AI model would be able to get those tags right. And we found it was drastically off, where our customers were expecting 3, 4, 5 nines of consistency, where if we had the model tag it versus what their journalists would do, we were off by orders of magnitude. And it caused us to go back to the drawing board and realize that we had to fine-tune the model for every single one of our customers as they came on. We had to look at their specific tag schema, the way their journalist standards had been used to select the way they thought was appropriate for SEO to get that bar up to the point where now today it actually is giving those results that they expect from us. So it's kind of a neat story of interchange of innovation, of observability, of thinking about your guideposts for how you come together around these features. Finally, performance is a huge thing in any platform. We have performance in terms of SEO and delivery of content. The same is true in fast-breaking news. If that experience of getting a headline or tags or summarization was just spinning away, our customers are going to turn elsewhere. They don't have the time to wait for models. Some of the cool demos that I've been experiencing here at re:Invent, the painting, the golf simulator, the basketball. There was one I did today on creating my own golf course simulation. I found myself waiting, and it was kind of ticking in my mind. I'm thinking, do I walk away and go to the next thing or not? And that's the same true for us and our stories here. So here you can see a great Datadog interface. We're able to drill in and see for specific queries how long it took the duration to get a response. And then we have KPIs in our product of what's acceptable and what's not, when our team members, when our customers, when the journalists and editors will turn elsewhere. So that was kind of the performance side that we were looking at. And then finally, we wanted to think about where things went in terms of specific, if I go back a couple times, I'm going to jump to this diagram because we used this interface to drill into specific cohorts of query types where we saw our customers were trying to achieve things and whether or not it was working well or not. So this was the view. I think we found some hallucinations. We found some other red flag areas. We saw that we needed to tune the out-of-the-box prompts that were in the platform, as well as tune the extensibility hooks. Our customers can actually define their own prompts for their newsrooms and add those in as buttons. For each one of those, they can select what model it goes to, what the criteria is, and the prompt that it gets sent to that model. So you mentioned earlier that there's some great services to auto-select what model these all go to. Our experience today is that's a really careful selection process for our customers. They really care about what the standards are for that model. They care about the SLAs, the legal implications. They care about what data that model was trained on. They care about the kind of results they get out of it. So we see much better models today in practice for doing the text-to-speech than we do for the auto-tagging. So having that flexibility in the platform, we have an interface where customers can choose which model it goes to. That plays into how we could confirm it here. Now, these are early days. As the tools evolve, as auto-selection takes place, as Datadog adds more capabilities here, we'll see if we're still in this kind of phase where we need to pick and choose between those options. I think this is the exciting thing about being where we are. We're thinking about new ways of using these tools, new technologies, the tooling's coming in place. All that together gives me some hope that some of the rough edges today with generative AI are getting smoothed out, and observability is a big part of that. So let's see. I think the last thing we want to talk about were some lessons learned. Before going there, Jason, is there anything you want to expand on in terms of the tooling and the scenarios you see us using it for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty more. We've talked about, things like getting the right answers and evaluating things. The other thing that we thought of as we were doing this, aside from leaking data, which you don't want to do, is actually active bad actors, right? And people trying to do prompt injection or really trying to actually hack into your system or use it to do things. And so that was the other piece that was really important for us, was as we evaluate, it's not simply a right and wrong, but tying that into some of our security products of also saying, this isn't just wrong, this is malicious actions, you need to actually look at that and harden your systems.
Yeah, that's a great example of where we talked here about a workflow example, that first stage of innovation. With the experiences, that's where if you go to Washington Post, there's some great new capabilities called Ask the Post, where you can, as a consumer, interact with an AI model that's been trained on the great historical depth of reporting that the Washington Post has. There's some other media sites that have similar capabilities, but that's the example where there's a lot of malicious activity that we observe coming in, where people are trying to figure out how they can get the model to respond in a certain way. Maybe that way is something that you want to associate with your brand. More often than not, if it's malicious, they're trying to get it to output something you don't want to have associated with your brand. Yeah. And so that's a big thing that's come into play as we go from those internal tools and capabilities to more B2C experiences where you've opened it up to a much wider range of attack, and that surface area becomes a problem. So I think that's a good example of the next stage in phase 2 for us. As we get to new products, that's going to be a whole new experience. And so I'm sure there'll be things we learn there when it comes to security as well. And as the deeply personal experiences come in, our goal is to kind of invert the concept of a CDN on its head. If you think about a CDN, it was designed to deliver the exact same content to every single reader. That's basically the core technology. It was a great innovation 20 years ago or plus, whenever it was. And now we want to say, instead of saying the same content to every single node, we want unique content. So at edge, we want to do the personalization. So I think there's a lot to come there in terms of the technologies to make that vision come true, and it's moving fast. So some tactics, some lessons learned. The first one might be for the CTOs in the room or dev managers. We all have technical debt, so to speak. We have legacy platforms. I mentioned I was very fortunate with ArcXP to inherit a platform that really was born in the cloud. But I would make sure your tech stack is ready before going down this. And that could be doing a kind of a sidecar experiment, so you may not have to retire everything, but if you're not in a position to really take advantage of API-first technologies and generative AI, that's something to think hard about, because you don't want that to interfere with your experimentation. You got to be able to move quickly. The next one, I think, was really a lesson for us. We benefited from setting that mission statement from the start. And so I'd encourage you to think about, for your organizations, for your company, what does it mean to use AI effectively? It's going to be very different for every company in media, but every company across the landscape of people looking to use AWS, certainly. Then finally, stay agile and humble. Early days, you're going to make mistakes. Things aren't going to go as you planned. I showed that chart where 90+% of the time it wasn't giving us the results, and that's a humbling experience. It's a humbling experience to see when features are used and when they're not used. And on that front, we really had kind of 3 different angles on that humbling experience. As journalists, a lot of concern within newsrooms about the proper way to use these technologies. There's challenges around transparency of what's happening under the hood. These models are black boxes. Only their top scientists can really understand what's going on inside them. And so if you're not a techie, if you're in the storytelling space, that can be a bit scary. What do you do with imperfections when the model doesn't give you exactly what you want? And for us, really inviting journalists to suggest amendments, contribute to the roadmap, was a key way to get past some of the humbling experience on that front. As a techie, we talked about hallucinations, talked about erratic results. We talked about new models popping up all the time. It's tough to keep pace. Certainly, whether you're leading an organization or you're an engineer trying to keep track of all the blogs, all the announcements just this week alone, it's hard. Vector and RAG, rankings and relevancy. That's not only about the semantics of an LLM, but also with time and date. Has that all come together? Operational challenges around observability. We talked about that and the cost. Then finally, as a media executive, I don't think there's any board out there today that's not asking their executives, where are we with generative AI? There's a lot of fear of missing out that's pervasive right now, where you're concerned about your competitor maybe getting a leg up and reinventing their business model and leapfrogging where you are. So I think that's a real humbling experience for us as executives. There's conflicts of interest, different strategies across groups about how to use these things, regulatory concerns, forward business model changes. All of that can really present challenges. And the agility that has made AWS so successful, that's made our software development culture so successful overall as an industry, I think is really important here for media executives to take note of. And finally, the risk management side, protecting IP and content concerns. I mentioned that's a huge thing for our industry. Brand reputation, cost implications, all that risk management, if you don't handle it properly, could bring your efforts to a freeze, really, right? Where your head counsel will come in and say, look, I'm sorry, we love this feature, but it's a no-go. There's too much risk here. If your risk register gets bloated like this because you've taken in generative AI, that's not a win for your business. So those were some things that really were humbling for my team, for our customers as we went through this journey over the last year or two. Then finally, Joey on my team, who leads our intelligence content team, had a quote that our observation really is that AI is often very good at doing what you don't want it to do. And it can be really hard to get it to do what you need. In my mind, when I think about my experience today in my everyday work as I use these models, it's almost like I've hired the best intern I could possibly get, straight out of the best schools, knows all the book knowledge, but has no hands-on experience. And so that's kind of, I think, what we see here, is that you can get an answer that really doesn't include all of the experience that we've learned as an industry together. And so that's one of the challenges that we see.
Yeah, and for us, the real lesson learned is similar, that AI is pretty hard. And building the tools, we realized that it really was about seeing problems, right? You can't solve a problem if you can't see that problem. And so as we dog-fooded our own product and we're using it to build bits, it was really about what do we need to see, and constantly banging our heads against the wall because we couldn't get the data, and then turning back to the LLM observability team and saying, hey, we need this information. Can you add that into the product? So thanks for coming to our talk. If you want to learn more about any of these tools, Datadog, as mentioned, we've got the giant booth out there, but we've got a smaller booth that's dedicated to the LLM observability product. So if you visit us at booth 1728, that's where you can find out more. Some of the engineers and product managers that actually built the product are there, so they'd be happy to dive deep with you about how they built it and everything that goes into how it operates. And then if you're interested in using a great LLM-powered product now, if you're in the media space, whether that's news or video, or really anything that's content-driven, ArcXP has fantastic tools. So arcxp.com is where you can learn more about those and get your hands on the screen that Joe was showing before.